going to be an honest, forthright, and fascinating evening with Bernie Taupin. Bernie, I mentioned my Bob Marley memory from here, but you have a very different Bob Marley memory.
Oh, yes. First, I'd like to apologize for anybody who bought tickets to The Lion King. You can always do a couple of verses of Can You Feel the Love Tonight?
Well, yeah. Well, that actually addresses the meerkat in the room.
The hunky meerkat.
Yes, that's right. Because Elton has done quite a few stage musicals now, only one with you.
Well, yes.
Yes.
Went down like a lead balloon.
We'll get around to that. But as you watch that side of his life, do you think, wish I were more a part of it or not?
Well, I had my experiences on Broadway, and I think the experience I had was very much a learning experience, but at the same time, I don't think I'd want to do it again. It's not really in my wheelhouse. I enjoyed it because it was a completely different kind of experience, than anything I'd ever done before. And I worked with some wonderful people, and I saw how theatre worked and how the stage worked. But the outcome of the show we did was not tremendous. But it was a learning curve, and as I always say, if you're going to, at least you can say you've tried it if you want to experience everything, which I've done in my life. I've tried so many different things, and luckily I've been successful in most of them. But again, if you fall on your face or fall on your butt, people, at least you can say you tried.
In the book, I thought Bernie was making a clever look forward when he said, while on holiday, he was reading Interview with the Vampire by Hen Fox. But then you never mentioned it again.
For good reason. I don't know. It was a memory of reading it for the first time, and it stayed with me, obviously, and ultimately it led to us doing the Broadway show. But as I said, some things work, some things don't.
The people in this hall will be very frustrated because they will never have heard those songs. Do you wish that the songs had somehow been saved?
Yeah, actually the songs were very good. I think the production was lacking in some way. And I don't think it was any fault of anybody in particular. There's no fingers to be pointed. I don't know, it definitely wasn't family friendly. We went basically for the jugular. Excuse the pun. Musically, I thought there were some really, really good songs in there. And over the years, there's been efforts by certain parties to try and get the music, released. And it would be nice for it to see the light of day someday, but I don't lose any sleep over it, certainly.
One of the things I love about the book is that Bernie doesn't talk about every song. It was not an attempt to be comprehensive. But when he does talk about a song that you know, there's usually a fresh slant on it. Mm-hmm. And beforehand we mentioned Candle in the Wind, because I'm obsessed with one fact about Candle in the Wind. It's the only song to be a hit in 3 successive decades, each time more successful than the last. And
pray elaborate. I don't remember.
Well, in the 70s, the original.
Right.
In the 80s, the live version from Australia.
Mm-hmm. Oh, right. I forgot about that one.
Yes. And then in the 90s. And I had remembered what you had told me 50 years ago, that Candle in the Wind had been a phrase that record man Clive Davis had used
about Janis Joplin.
But you write in your book that the person you originally were writing it about was
Montgomery Clift. Yeah. But also the title, I didn't cop that from Clive Davis. In fact, I don't even know if Clive Davis was aware of the fact that where I got the title from was from a book by Alexander Solzhenitsyn called Candle in the Wind, which was about the gulags. And I always just thought it was a great title, and I kept it in my back pocket at the right time. And then when I saw a movie that John Huston made, I believe he directed it, called The Misfits.
Mm-hmm.
And it starred Clark Gable,
Marilyn Monroe was her name.
and Montgomery Clift. And the character of Montgomery Clift really appealed to me, whereas, unfortunately, the Marilyn Monroe character did not appeal to me at all, because she basically sort of whined most of the movie about animal cruelty, because Montgomery Clift was a rodeo rider. And so I much more was enamored by his personality and his character than hers. And so I put two and two together and came up with the idea of doing Candle in the Wind about Montgomery Clift, because I mean, he appealed to me, and again, he sort of adhered to that phrase, you know, live fast, die young, leave a beautiful corpse. So, for 10 seconds, he was my choice. And then I suddenly realized that the majority of people probably wouldn't be familiar with Montgomery Clift and not be sort of sympathetic and not have any particular interest in it. So I sort of changed directions, and I thought, well, I'm not crazy about Marilyn Monroe, but she seems the perfect character for the, she's iconic, fragile, and she's a perfect metaphor for Candle in the Wind. So I did change direction, and it was probably a very good idea, I think, ultimately. But yeah, but at the same time, it literally could have been about anybody, or not anybody, but anybody who, James Dean, you know, would have been perfect too, you know. But again, I think her character was definitely more sympathetic, and as I say, fragile, and more in tune with the title, I think.
When Princess Diana died, my walk from work to home took me through the mall. And so in that week leading up to the funeral, I couldn't help but notice that the assembled mourners who filled St. James Park were singing either Yesterday or Candle in the Wind. So for some reason, it resonated with them, and it did make a logical choice. Bernie has written in the book that if you were to ask him tonight to recite the new lyrics, you can't.
No, you could put a gun to my head and say, recite the lyrics to the Diana Candle in the Wind. But there's a reason for that, though. I mean, if I think about it in retrospect, I've only probably ever heard the song a couple of times, because when I rewrote it at Elton's request, which was the reason I did it, and it came again, it was one of the lyrics in my life that just seemed to come immediate. It was very immediate. I mean, I probably did it within half an hour. And, you know, I knew the melody, so it was fairly much of a no-brainer. But the thing is that once I did it and delivered it to Elton, the next time I heard it was when he played it at the funeral, and then he went directly from the funeral to Abbey Road Studios and recorded it with George Martin. And it was released the following week, and that was the last time I ever heard it. I mean, I know it was all over the radio, but I'm not somebody who has their ear pressed to the radio very often, so, or certainly not at the time. So I've not, and he expressly said that he didn't want to perform it ever again once he played it. It wasn't, I mean, it's not something he's going to do live. I mean, it doesn't really make much sense. So yeah, I don't remember any of it, so...
Well, for a time, it was the best-selling single in history.
You mean it's not anymore?
Physical sales, yes, but because it was deleted, White Christmas has returned to number one.
I think that's a good thing.
Now, in the book, you rate your recordings quite honestly. They're not the opinions that you might expect them to have. And you're really down on a couple of albums. And one of them I wanted to ask about, because I didn't think it was that bad, which was Jump Up.
Oh,
because it had Anti-Burn, and it had...
Yeah, that was the only good track on it.
Well,
it was worth it. The album was worth it for that song, which, again, that's one of my favorite songs. So,
and Gary Osborne had Blue Eyes. That was nice.
Right.
Well,
this is a funny story, actually, because in the book I talk about the album Blue Moves, and I sort of critique my work on that album as being a little depressing. And I think when Elton read the book, the first thing he did was he called me and he goes, "I didn't know you didn't like Blue Moves." And I said, "Wait a minute. I didn't say I didn't like it. I said I thought that some of my work on it was a bit close to the bone and a little slick at wrist time." And he goes, oh, okay, all right.
Well, actually, there was someone in the audience here who was involved in the promotion of Blue Moves, who's Caroline Thatcher, your old friend.
Oh, Caroline.
And we're going
I
to...
can't see the crowd very well.
Yeah, and we will mention Caroline in a moment.
Yes.
But Caroline and Laura Kroger asked me to come up with a tape of blue songs, blue, etc.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I thought you meant filthy song.
I could have done that. So I, of course, when I first heard Blue Moves, I thought, this is going to puncture the balloon. Because it isn't nice Elton, it's sad Elton. And thank God for Sorry Seems to Be the Hardest Word, which was the big hit off of the record. And then I went to see Elton do the promotional show at Wembley Arena. I went with Muff Winwood.
Oh, great. Yeah.
And let's just give a shout out to Muff and Zena.
Are they here?
No. But they really were nice to you.
Oh, they were fantastic. Yeah, I don't know if anybody knows who Muff Winwood is, but he was originally the bass player for the Spencer Davis group, and he was Stevie Winwood's brother. And in our sort of early fledgling days, they lived around the corner from where Elton and I lived at in Front Court in Northwood Hills, where we shared a flat with his mother there. And they lived around the corner. And Muff was actually an executive at Island Records. He discovered people like Sparks and quite a lot of people, actually.
He produced Sultans of Swing.
Yes, right, exactly. But anyway, we'd go around there every Friday night and play that foosball thing. And we'd take a box of, what were those chocolates called? Dairy, quality free, and a bottle of the Tousse Rosé. But it was great. I mean, and he was really one of our first huge supporters, and actually tried to get us signed to Island Records, but it sort of didn't.
Oh my God! Here's one of the great stories of all time. John Reed, who became the manager of Elton and a partner with Bernie and Rocket Records, went over to Muff's for dinner at one point, and Muff said, just amusedly, that he had a contract upstairs for him to be Elton's manager. And from the earlier days, look after us. And so John Reed said, "Oh, can I see it?" So Muff went upstairs, brought her back down, and John Reed went.
I thought you were going to tell the Jeff Beck story in Dick James.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if many people know this story. It was funny. When Jeff Beck had the Jeff Beck group with, I guess it was with Ronnie Wood and Rod Stewart. When Rod Stewart and Ronnie Wood left, Jeff Beck, who'd been touring extensively in the United States at that time and was very successful, he was without a band, basically. So he approached Elton, who had just started playing with Dee and Nigel at that time, and looked at them and thought, this is the perfect fit for me, because I've got a band here and I've got a singer. So this would be a perfect substitute for Rod and Ronnie. So he came to, and obviously at the time, we were like thrilled by that, the idea of that. It's like Jeff Beck, it's like built-in audience already. And so Jeff Beck's manager, who I can't remember who he was a very slick guy, went to see Dick James, who was managing Elton at the time, who had our publishing. And he went to see him and sort of said, this is a really good opportunity for your boy to get a built-in audience in the United States. And Dick said, no, not going to happen. He said, I guarantee you that Elton, is going to go to the States within a year, and within 2 years will be bigger than Jeff Beck. And the guy went, you're crazy. And we were like, are you out of your mind? And it was right. It was right. We forgave him.
Well, I'm glad you forgave him for that. Because I remember the day when you were getting silver discs for Crocodile Rock at DJM. And Elton revealed that DJM would not pay for ads for Daniel.
Oh, I don't remember that at all.
Right. Okay. Well, now, we just had...
That's why he's here.
Right. Well, I have discovered an error in Wikipedia, and you may think, well, that's nothing new. But it said that The Captain and the Kid was the first album on which you both appeared on the cover. But of course,
Tumbleweed. But slight discrepancy. On Captain and the Kid, we were both on the front cover. On Tumbleweed, I was on the back cover. And actually, I've been on the back cover on quite a few albums. Tumbleweed, I wasn't on the front. Captain and the Kid was the only album where I was actually on the front.
But it was the same photo. Anyway, spread over the gate photo. And can I propose that that is a very underrated album? But a
Captain and the Kid.
Well, that, yes, but also Tumbleweed.
Oh, is it underrated? I thought Captain and the Kid was pretty
Well,
underrated.
Captain and the Kid, which peaked at number 18, and Tumbleweed peaked at number 4. But of course, Tumbleweed didn't have...
It didn't have any singles.
It didn't have a single.
Right.
And I thought it a shame that Burn Down the Mission didn't get more exposure. Because Burn Down the Mission is the song that knocked them out at the Troubadour.
Right. Well, the interesting thing about Tumbleweed, too, you say underappreciated, I think I have a strange problem with looking back on the success of singles and albums when they came out originally. I mean, because our compositions or our body of work has had so much longevity over time and has traveled so well, you kind of forget that some of them weren't as successful as you think they might have been when they first came out. I mean, people hear things like, Tiny Dancer and Rocket Man, and they weren't like huge hits when they first came out.
Rocket Man was.
It was?
That was number 2.
I'll be going.
What?
But the albums too. I mean, the thing about they've traveled well, because something like Tumbleweed, I mean, it's a lot of people's favorite album. And I get that so often. I come across people, especially in the Americana and countryside of music. That's their favorite album. But again, it wasn't a huge success at the time. But now people think of it as being a huge success.
Yeah. And of course, Amarina was at the beginning of Dog Day Afternoon.
Yeah, which was really strange. The funny thing about that is that when that was used, I mean, you know, if you remember the opening of A Dog Day Afternoon, it sort of pans across the streets of New York in the early 70s when it was a very dangerous place. And having that track alongside of that seemed so weird the first time that I saw it, because it's basically a sort of country song, you know. And now you can't see that movie without hearing that song. I mean, it's sort of ingrained in the sort of film myth of that particular movie.
And there were a couple of noteworthy covers from that. Rod, of course, did Country Comfort.
Oh, right, yeah.
And then Betty White, Talking Old Soldiers. Have you heard of that?
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I was aware of that, but I'd forgotten about that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was wonderful. And a strange song to cover. I mean, not the sort of song that you would think multitudes of people were going to cover. I guess that's why only one person did.
Well, you mentioned the albums that people think were great successes when they came out, but actually weren't, and Mad Men, Across the Water. You know, this is the album that has become more successful in later years than it was.
Well, that's exactly my point that I just referenced earlier. You know, again, I mean, I think the first #1 album that we ever had, certainly in the States, was Honky Chateau, right? See, I defer to you all the time. But Mad Men, Mad Men has a particular place in my heart, definitely, because it's the first album that was written and recorded after we came to the United States in 1970. So the interesting thing is that although Tumbleweed is an unbelievably American album, which was obviously spawned from us listening to the band and music from Big Pink, which, you know, I owe a great debt of gratitude to, because that album really opened doors for me. It made me it made me realize that I could write the kind of songs that I wanted to write about subject matter that I really, really wanted to write about. If you think about it, it's very odd, because Tumbleweed came after the Black Album, which is the Elton John album that has 60 Years On, King Must Die, Border Song. And
Is the one with the egg on it?
the one with the egg on it, we'll get to that.
Yeah.
So if you think how radical it was from going from the Elton John album, which was a very sort of almost symphonic, you know, highly orchestrated album, to go from that to the Tumbleweed Connection album, which was so organic, and songs about the American West and the Civil War. Now I don't think you could do that, but back then it was totally acceptable. But the funny thing about Tumbleweed was it was written and recorded before we even went to the States. It was all from the mythic America that was in my head, you know, schooling in my head all the time. From all of the country music I'd ingested, from all the westerns I'd ingested, the history I'd read about. So that was all in its own way. The thing about Mad Men is that was written and recorded after we'd been to the States. So in my mind, that's almost a sort of geographical road trip of the United States. Because the minute I got to the United States, I went out and visited all of these places that I'd only read about or dreamt about. And so I went and saw all those things firsthand. So everything on Mad Men was drawn from those trips. So in that way, I think Mad Men is definitely the most American album we ever made, and to this day.
You mentioned Tiny Dancer, and it has become your most downloaded song.
Again, I didn't know that.
Until Cameron, your song was the most downloaded. But in the book, you, to my fascination, explain that this song isn't just based on your first wife. She's about a fourth of it. There are other things, including the Jeremy Spencer Children of God.
Right. Well, I don't think of Tiny Dancer being about anyone in particular. I think it's a composite, and it was, in my mind, it was really more of a homage to Los Angeles at the time. And it was inspired by a lot of different people. I mean, the seamstress for the band was based on a woman called Janice Larkin, who actually, talking of Madden, sewed the cover of the Madden album and did all the embroidery on it, hence seamstress for the band. So yeah, it was a lot of different people. I always say, just because you dedicate something to somebody doesn't mean it's necessarily about them. Same with an album, you know, if you dedicate an album to somebody, you know, it doesn't mean that all the songs on the album are about those people. So, but yeah, I don't think of Tiny Dancer really as a love song. I think it's more of a salute to a city.
Which is, of course, in contrast with 99% of the people.
How you write books, isn't it?
Yeah. And also, to skate over finally the subject of your first wife, it was she who said that it is that, isn't it?
I believe so, yes. I mean, I could stand to be corrected, but I think you're correct in that one.
Yeah. Elton came over and she said the bitch is back. And then, further, well, of course, we've got to talk about Cameron, because the way that he made the film almost famous.
Right.
And just inserted that magical sequence.
Yeah, well, I think that's also the beauty of some of our songs, is that they seem to travel through the decades and find new life everywhere. And I think that's the beauty of them. They have a timeless quality to them, or I like to think they do. And Tiny Dancer has obviously been one of those. In fact, you know, even now with the Dia Lupa thing, you know, which lends itself to that too. But
oh,
yeah,
Britney Spears.
it's Britney Spears, isn't it? Yes.
Sorry. You can ask me about my life.
Well, what's the Dia Lupa one?
Well, Rocket Man.
Oh, it's Rocket Man, right. Good. I told you I don't listen to the radio. Where were we? Oh yeah, Cameron. So yes, I mean that was just a stroke of genius. I don't think I even knew about that before I saw the movie. I think when I saw the movie, it was the first time I paid attention to it and realised it was in there. So, and I didn't know Cameron at that point. So, but yes, I mean it seems to just keep coming back.
Cameron, it is dear to me because when I was the American in London for Rolling Stone magazine, he was in Los Angeles doing the same kind of thing. And then, of course, he became more intimately involved with you when he made the film of the Union.
Right, absolutely, yes, yeah.
And it's hard to explain to people who never saw Leon Russell what a great performer.
Oh, yeah. Anybody here see Leon Russell?
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, I mean, the thing is that, Elton definitely resurrected Leon. And as I say, a lot of people, I think especially maybe in this country, don't realize what a huge star he was in America at a certain point, certainly in our fledgling years. I mean, when we first went over there in 1970, Leon was at the height of his powers. He'd just come off of the Mad Dogs and Englishmen tour with Joe Cocker, and he was just the guy. I mean, everybody wanted him on their albums. You know, he was responsible for playing Delaney and Bonnie. You know, George Harrison used him at the concert for Bangladesh, which, if anybody's seen that, his performance on that is phenomenal. And the fact that he was sitting center row at the Troubadour the first night that we played at the Troubadour when we went to the stage, I don't think I've ever seen Elton more terrifying. Because Elton absolutely worshipped Leon. I mean, worshipped him as a piano player. I think the only two people that Elton really, really felt that way about as a piano player was Jerry Lee Lewis and Leon Russell, without a doubt. And funnily enough, I think this story's in the book, but years later when we were recording Leon, he mentioned about being at the Troubadour that night, and he'd gone to the Troubadour with a guy called Danny Cordell who ran Shelter Records with Leon. And Leon said that after Elton went off, he turned to Danny Cordell and said, "Well, that's my career over." Which, I mean, I think that was an exaggeration on his part. But we ended up touring with Leon and spent some wonderful time with him. Leon introduced us to Bob Dylan. He was hugely instrumental in being encouraging to us. And so it was great all those decades later to be able to, by that time he was just touring the States on a dilapidated old bus, playing truck stops and, you know, beer halls. And through Elton's generosity, and just when he found out about that, you know, as Elton does, wears his heart on his sleeve, and he was determined to resurrect him, and hopefully we did a good job.
Well, indeed. And this is the guy who wrote the song Superstar, which was a huge hit for the Carpenters and for Luther Vandross. I mean,
and he also wrote, what's the other huge classic he wrote too? Not Song for You, but there's another one that he wrote.
Song for You.
Why don't you know that?
Well, of course, I think of the Will of the Wisp album,
right,
which he did, which was a really good album, Lady Blue. However, come around 2010, as you say, he's actually performing in a truck stop. I mean, can you dig it? And what I didn't realize was that he hadn't had any of the fine life at his peak that many of the successors of that period did. And you say in the book how you would have dinner with him, and he would look.
Oh, he loved to eat, man. Especially when he was older. Yeah, I mean, and he was in a wheelchair by that time, and he still looked fantastic. I mean, still had the long white hair and the beard. It just didn't have the top hat anymore. But no, he was extraordinary. When we were making the album, we would go to dinner like every night. And he didn't have a sophisticated palate, but he used to want to go to the same restaurant every night, and because it was run by a friend of ours, and he just felt comfortable there. But he would get the menu and he'd go through it. He couldn't say my name, by the way, because he was from Oklahoma, so I was always Barney. And in fact, on the album cover, I think in his dedications, he says, "I apologize to Bernie for never being able to pronounce his name and making him sound like a purple dinosaur." But yeah, he was very special. But yeah, he would get the menu and he'd see like beef bourguignon, and then, you know, "Barney, what's that? Would I like that?" And he'd do the same thing every night. But it was just magical to be able to spend time with him. In fact, I think it's in the book. Another great story of Leon's was I don't know if you know this, but Leon originally was part of the Wrecking Crew, who played on every single record in the early 60s, the Byrds, you know, to Frank Sinatra, everybody, you know, Hal Blaine and the whole gang. And he said the Wrecking Crew were working at RCA Studios, and as I say, this was like in the early mid-60s. And he said he ran into Elvis in the corridor. And Elvis was sort of wandering around on his own in the corridor. And Leon, who'd been imbibing, feeling kind of a little braver than normal, said to Elvis, "Hey Elvis, how come you making all those shitty movies?" And Elvis kind of looked at him, and I don't know what he was on either, and he says, "I don't know, man, the last thing I remember I was driving a truck." Whether that's true or not, it's still priceless.
It is priceless. You just mentioned the only person who ever pronounced your surname the French way.
Oh, Frank Sinatra, yeah. Well, Frank Sinatra, I only met Frank Sinatra once, and it was, you know, they say you shouldn't meet your heroes. Well, he blew that one right out of the water because he couldn't have been nicer. He was fantastic, so complimentary. But he would do a couple of in his later years, he would do a couple of our songs on stage. And we actually wrote a song for him called Remember, which was kind of an iffy song. It wasn't that great, but it was definitely sort of Frank Sinatra type of song. But anybody who knows about Frank Sinatra knows that Frank would always, before he'd sing a song, he'd always credit the arranger and the songwriters. And when he did this, I went to see him, I think it was at the Greek, maybe it's the Hollywood Bowl. And anyway, before he sang a song about us, he said, "This is a song written by Elton John and Bernie Taupin." And I was like, whoa, how did he even know that? And it's funny because Taupin in French is roughly translated means the little mole. So, it makes kind of sense because I'm always digging deep for song material. But so I was pretty impressed by that. It was the only time in my life that anybody has ever pronounced my name that way, other than people in France.
The one thing about this songwriting partnership, which to me is unique outside of its length and endurance, is the fact that it's the only songwriting partnership that seems to have a single authorial voice. In other words, sorry, what that means is, I never think that Elton didn't do it, even though I know that Elton didn't do it. You know,
I got you.
The only thing you could even make a comparison to is Roger Daltrey and Pete Townsend. But there Pete Townsend writes all the songs and Roger sings them. You think it's coming from Roger. Somehow, your mental fusion with Elton enables him to project your words as if they were the character of
Right. Yeah, I got no real answer for that. I mean, that's just, I guess that's like the perfect marriage, you know, it's an understanding. Again, it's one of those things I never try to question. It is what it is. And I don't have any great theory for it. The one thing I do try to do is I try not to be selfish when I write and write, be completely me all the time. You know, I've written about my experiences, but I've always tried to make them something that he can relate to in his own way, you know, that he may have experienced too. So I like to think in the same way as our partnership is 50-50, the content of the songs is very much the same. You know, I say I never wanted to be selfish. You know, I've written about my own experiences, but I've also written about his. And no more so than in Captain Fantastic and the Brown Dirt Cowboy. I mean, that's a perfect example of writing about us, you know, me and you against the world sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, I guess that's another way that makes it sort of special.
To underline my point, I'm going to ask every one of you in this audience who you think I'm Still Standing is about. And you think it's about Elton, and he's coming back off of his dodgy years, and he's returning. It's you.
Well, it was originally, and now I regret it, really. Because there's no great secret about that, and I write about it in the book. Yeah, I mean, the original I'm Still Standing was written about a former girlfriend of mine, and it was basically, if you listen to the lyrics, it's sort of a kiss-off. But you know, those things come back to haunt you and bite you in the butt, because I sort of regret that I wrote it about her, because she's one of my best friends. But at least she got a good song out of it. The thing is that, I know we were supposed to take a break, but hang on one second. I much prefer that people think it's a song about Elton. You know, because yes, it came at a time when he was getting back on track, and what album was that on?
Too Low for Zero.
Too Low for Zero, which was a big return to form for us. And it was after, he got basically out of rehab. So, that's the story.
And I'm going to defy our 45-minute limit with one more question, because it's a similar question. And that is the song Sacrifice. Also came from your home.
Yeah, the thing about Sacrifice that I always like to bring up is that Sacrifice to me is the bookend. It's the right side of this that is your song. Your song, I like to think, is written about a very virginal kid, very naive in the ways of love and awkward, hence the sort of pregnant pauses in the song, the way that it's written. It's very, what do I want to say next? How do I want to say this? And then you fast forward through the decades and you get a song like Sacrifice, which is the absolute opposite of your song. It's about that same guy, this guy, who's been through all of the rigors of relationships, divorces, marriage, falling apart, and Sacrifice is just that sort of, that kind of voice of the same kid after all that experience. There's a weariness to it. And it's also, I think, as good a song as your song. I think they're both magnificent songs, but what they say is what they both have is pure, unadulterated honesty.
And it was #1 here for 5 weeks.
Yeah. Well, that's right. I didn't know there was #1 here. Wasn't there #1?
And when I saw Bernie's promotion for this book on the CBS television network in America with Gail King and the presenters who were in an arc around, she said, "And what's your favorite song that you've written?" And Sacrifice. And then you could tell the air went out of the room. Because they were all hoping he'd say Rocket Man or
Yeah. Well, when people ask you a question like that, #1 is impossible to answer anyway. And it's never going to be one of those mega hits or one of those really recognizable songs because you've heard it so much. So it always tends to be something that's not quite as well known.
Well, we'll talk about more songs that are well known and some that aren't well known when we come back. Enjoy your intro. And we are back, and why not start, as we have just heard Elton's version of Lucy, to talk about your extraordinary relationship with John Lennon.
And where do you want to start?
Yes. Well, maybe, Madison Square Garden. And that flight we had back from Boston,
Which you were on.
which I was on, there was Elton did a gig in Boston Garden, home of the Boston Celtics at the time, and John Lennon came up to check it out because he had to, in inverted commas.
Do you want to preface that with the bet?
Yes, the bet was that if whatever gets you through the night got to #1, because Elton was playing on it, that John would have to appear on Elton's show. And of course he thought, well, this will never be #1. And it was. So he thought, oh, I've got to keep up my part of the bargain.
Right.
So he went to Boston.
Yeah, to check out the show and see what he's got himself into, basically.
Yeah. And then we flew back. Was it the Starship or was it?
It was the Starship, yeah, which Elton was using to tour at the time. It was previously used by Led Zeppelin. We had it highly clean. Sanitized. Yeah, it was. It was the same plane, and yes, John, as you said, had lost the bet and had gone to Boston to check out Elton, see what he was in for. And then we came, I believe the Madison Square Garden show was on Thanksgiving, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it was. And it's interesting, people don't believe us when we collectively talk about John's behavior before the show. Not that it was bad behavior, but he was petrified about going on. And I've had a lot of people question that by saying, how could John Lennon be afraid of going on stage? And what people don't realise is John had not played live on stage in years and years. I mean, probably a good decade. And technology had advanced so much by then, you know, the stage monitors from the time when the Beatles were playing. I mean, when the Beatles played, they couldn't hear anything, obviously, as you know. And technology on stage was just very prehistoric. And so it was almost new to him. It was completely new, and he was absolutely petrified to the point where he was physically sick. Now, he looked like $1 million. I mean, he had the black suit and the gardenia and the dark glasses, and I mean, he just looked unbelievable, and he had the white strap, and just great. But he was terrified, up to the point where he just went, I don't know if I can go on, I don't know if I can go on. And there's lots of different stories about that night, and you know, a lot of urban legend has probably seeped into history. But he was standing at the side of the stage next to me, and he said, I don't know if you've got to come on with me. And I kind of looked at him and said, do what? In fact, in Elton's autobiography, Me, he's quoted as saying, even a nervous Beatle couldn't persuade Taupin to go on stage. And so we literally had to sort of propel him onto the stage. But the ovation and the reaction of the crowd, I've never in my life ever seen anything like it.
And may I just second that? If sheer force of love could raise the roof on a building, the top of Madison Square Garden would have flown off.
Well, Madison Square Garden had, at the time, it doesn't do it anymore. I don't know, they've stabilized it some way, but back in the 70s, when the crowd were really stamping the floor and applauding, literally the building would shake, the floor would shake, it'd be going up and down like that. And I really thought that night the roof was going to come off. I've never heard an ovation or applause like it. It wasn't applause. It was absolutely explosive. And the minute he started, it was like he was the rock god he was. I mean, it was unbelievable. And the funny thing is that when they finally came off and they went back on for the encore, he did drag me with him. And I did. And it was like, and somebody handed me a tambourine. And sort of backed off slowly. But yeah, there's a great picture in the book of the two of us on stage, and he's got his arm like wrapped around me so I can't leave. You know? But yeah, definitely one of the highlights of my life and an extremely fond memory. And it was followed up by some more interesting stories in this company.
Yeah,
you have to read the book for that.
Yeah, one of which involves someone who is mentioned on Captain and the Kid, and that's Brian Wilson.
Right, yeah.
Because, of course, you successfully conveyed what a thrill it was to meet Brian Wilson. But Brian Wilson and John Lennon together was a story, wasn't it?
Yeah, John and I had gone to an afternoon party at a lady called Jeannie Martin, who was the ex-wife of Dean Martin. And she used to have these sort of house parties where you get a mix of just cross-generational, different careers, movie stars, rock stars, whatever, you know, people like David Bowie would be there. Anyway, John and I went, and it was a very delightful party. Brian Wilson was there, who was one of the sweetest men on earth. But at that particular, those were what they call the sandbox years, you know. I mean, he was certainly a fragile flower, not necessarily a cat in the wind, but very fragile and a little odd. And at one point, Brian, who I knew relatively well, came and sat next to me, and John was sort of next to me and whispered in my ear, "Bernie, I got to meet John Lennon. I've got to meet John Lennon." And I said, "No problem, Brian. You know, John, you know, Brian wants to say hi. And so John came over and sat next to him, and they talked for a few minutes, and, you know, it was all good. And we moved on. And then about 5 minutes later, Brian came back again and said to me, Bernie, I've got to meet John. Okay, things are happening here. So I went back to John, and I said, he wants to meet you again. John was really wonderful, and he said, no problem. And so they talked again for a few minutes, and then we sort of went over to the other side of the room. And I turn around, and there's Brian. And he goes, I've got to. And it was like, John, he wants to meet you again. And so, again, they talked for a few minutes. And then we decided to leave, you know. This is getting a little odd. So as we're walking towards the door, you know, I said to John, I'm sorry about that, you know, I don't know what to say. And he just looks at me, and in that John Lennon drawl, he goes, oh, bless him, he's not well, you know. I said, well, this relates to the opening of the chapter about John in the book, because at the beginning of the chapter on the plane, one of the things that amazed me was John and I were talking about songs. And John actually said to me, he said, I don't know if you've ever heard it, but I wrote this song called Across the Universe. And I'm like, you've got to be living on like Pluto. That song, you know, I've been asleep for the last 100 years, you know. So, but anyway, so fast forward back to that was what Brian Wilson wanted to talk to him about. I said, well, what did you want to find out from you? And he said, oh, he wanted to talk about All Across the Universe. Which, how odd is that? You know,
Very odd. You know, Brian, who I have met and interviewed, he's a sweet guy.
he's much better now.
Yes. During the Sandbox years, Tom Petty wrote beautifully. They were in a restaurant together, and Brian was very well behaved until he started buttering his head.
But also, I'm sorry, but you know, also, I have to say, because I don't want to make fun of Brian Wilson, because the word genius is bandied about way too much these days. There are very few real geniuses, and Brian Wilson is definitely one of them. And when we did the Union album, Brian came in to do a harmony part on one of the songs. And he did 26 layered vocals on this one track. Everyone was a tiny bit different. And it was absolutely staggering to see him do that. I mean, the guy is just, music just pours out of his head. I mean, the guy is an absolute genius. And when he left the studio, I said to him, can we do anything for you, give you anything? He said, I'd like a really big humbug. But a genius.
Yeah, and I was present when Brian came up with his daughter to meet George Martin backstage at an event. And George said to the girl, I hope you realize your father is a very great man. And I thought that was beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, how are you going to see me now? You know what I'm talking about when I say those words. And that is that although you have heard only Elton songs, or songs performed by Elton during the bar breaks, nonetheless, Bernie has had hits with people other than Elton, which we should mention because one of them was quite a project, which was with Alice Cooper.
Right, yeah. Well, Alice has been one of my friends since the very early 70s, one of my best friends. I mean, I don't get to see him as much now because he's constantly touring. He lives in Arizona and I live in California. But we go way, way back. And at certain points in our career, you know, we we spent so much time together that we did decide it was probably the best thing we could do was to make an album together, which was From the Inside, and which was based on his sort of reminiscing about being in a detox. I mean, it wasn't really a matter of drying out, you know, one of those Betty Ford Center things. This was a serious, you know, almost like a mental institution that he went to. And so he came back with so many stories about the characters that were in the place that, again, it was perfect subject matter for an album and songs, you know, my bread and butter. So yeah, we made an album together. It was quite successful. We had a couple of hits off it. But yeah, I mean, we've just spent so much time. There's a lot about Alice in the book, and again, one of the nicest guys on the face of the earth.
Which leads to another co-writer that Bernie had, Martin Page, with whom he had 2 American #1s in 1 year.
Well, in 2 months, I think, back to back.
Yes, it was quite extraordinary, and I wonder how many people here know what those records were. You want to shout them out?
Billy City.
See, yes.
Go to the top of the class and sharpen all the pencils. As they used to say.
Yes.
We built the city, probably the most loathed song I've ever done. in many periodicals voted the worst song of all time. A lot of those periodicals don't exist.
Successful.
Well, this song was amazing in so many regards, of course, because it was a #1 for Jefferson Starship, who had never had a #1 as Jefferson Airplane. Right. And it featured Les Garland doing the voiceover in the middle.
That's right, yeah.
From MTV, who had been a San Francisco DJ.
I haven't heard that song in so long I forgot about that, yeah. It's not something I play every day at home.
Was it your idea? I have to ask, because it continues to survive. We built this city on rock and roll.
Well, the interesting thing about that song is that I owe the success ratio of it to a guy called Peter Wolf. Because when Martin Page and I wrote that song originally, it was a very sort of dark, eerie, the demo, if you heard the original demo of it, it's pretty odd. I mean, it's nothing like the studio version that ended up. And that's because if you look at the credits on the song, it's not just Martin Page and myself, it's credited to, I think, a guy called Peter Wolf and a guy called Dennis Lambert, I think, who in the studio turned it into that sort of anthemic song that it became. So I owe a debt of gratitude. Am I feeding back? Oh, yes, okay. I just don't want to be annoying for you. Okay, yeah, sorry.
And the other one was Alone by Heart. And that was more of a, shall we say, conventional love song.
Yeah, I don't really remember where that came from. I mean, it's just a sort of ethereal ballad, basically. Let's leave it at that, because I don't really have any recollection of writing that. I say that is because Martin and I wrote a lot of songs at one time, and they came from a lot of different places. And I mean, as I say, the interesting thing about that song, it's the only heart song that Nancy Wilson sings, and not Anne. And I think a lot of it had to do with the video on it, because it's the height of MTV, and you know, the video was very popular. But yeah, that's a pretty good song.
Well, it's not over yet, folks, because Bernie had a Christmas #1 before Elton did. Now this, yes, we built this city on sausage.
Oh my! The funny thing, the beautiful thing about that song is that keeps rearing its. I mean, you hear it everywhere, anywhere. You know, it's one of those songs. It's a bit, you know, you hear it at. It's like We Are the Champions. You know, you hear it at football games and baseball games or whatever. The funny thing is, it keeps getting used in commercials. I mean, I get requests literally every week for it to be used. It gets used in sort of corporate ads. But now, there's an ad in the States that, you know, I watch a lot of football, I mean American football, sorry. And I watch sports all the time, so there's always the same commercials in between the games. And there's one now that is, we built this toilet. Some kind of water, I don't know what it is, but yeah, it's actually we built this toilet. So yeah, as I say, the gift that keeps on giving. Right?
Well, to mention another song with which Elton was not associated, you'll know what I mean if I fondly recommend and reminisce about the whores of Paris.
Wow.
Because of your solo album.
Okay, that's really getting obscure.
Okay. But it's in the book.
It's in the book, yeah. Yeah, that was a song off an album I did called He Who Rides the Tiger. It was a record, I think it was on Silent, wasn't it?
Electra,
right. It was kind of an interesting album. It was melodically a bit wanting, but lyrically it was the structures of the songs were pretty interesting. But I think what you're trying to refer to, and going back to our dear friend Carolyn Powsher, she's out there, she can attest to this story. When my PA and I was living in Paris for quite some time in the early 70s, and we'd go to a lot of sort of very fancy nightclubs. And there was one in particular called Regimes, who was the lady that basically invented the discotheque. Anyway, but we'd go to these kind of places, and then we'd go to these we'd be driving home, and we'd see these really sort of weird, seedy places, and we'd go, gotta see what's in there, you know. And we got, I'm going to cut a long story short because it's kind of lengthy, but we got to know all of these, let's call them ladies of the night. And they were extraordinary women. They were just amazing. It was like sort of characters from the Moulin Rouge or something like that. And they basically weren't really prostitutes. What they would do was they'd sort of fleece sort of European businessmen at the bar. What they'd do was they'd sort of chat them up and they'd get them to sort of buy champagne for them. And we always wondered why the floor underneath the bar was so sticky. Because what they would do is they would just take a glass and pour it away, you know, and keep getting them to pour champagne, they pour it out, and they pour more, and, you know. That's how they made their money, basically, by on the bottles of champagne consumed. But anyway, we got to know them, and there were about 6 of them, and they were fantastic characters. And no, we never... but they really were like something out of a comic opera. They were fantastic. And simultaneously, at the same time, I was promoting, I don't know if they were promoting I think it was a book I had at the time of my illustrated lyrics or something like that. And I think Caroline, I don't know, somebody had arranged basically a press reception at the hotel I was staying at in Paris. And inadvertently, a few nights earlier, late at night, I mentioned to these young ladies that we were doing this thing, and if they wanted to turn up, it would be fine. You know. Bad idea. Really bad idea. So I can't remember the exact details, but sort of as the press reception started and sort of the questions started, there was this like influx of women coming in at the door and dressed to the nines. They all, as I say, they all looked like they were out of some, you know, some weird old Victorian kind of movie, you know, feathers and everything. And it was like they were coming out, you know, and it was like, what's happening? I mean, this is insane. And they were sort of helping themselves to the food at the buffet, and it just turned into this complete circus. And we had to sort of basically shut the thing down for about half an hour while we my PA wrangled them all, and sort of in the end they kind of left. But it was completely insane. And that song that you mentioned was it was basically my sort of recall of the characters that I met there.
Well, we call the book Scattershot because it is Scattershot, and it omits one of my favorite songs, The One. Now, The One was the title tune of the album of the same name. It was a top 10 hit. And I thought it was just the perfect summation of one's feelings when one finally meets the soulmate.
Mm-hmm.
But because you didn't mention it, I don't know if you're fond of it.
I like it. I mean, it's not one that sort of rings true to me. I mean, I don't really think of it that often. So I don't think that's because I don't really care for it. I just, as I say, it really doesn't come to mind when I think of, you know, the sort of top 10 if there has to be one. But no, I really, there's no sort of particular feelings for it one way or the other.
Well, there's one 90s album that we know isn't in Bernie's top 10, and that is The Big Picture. But why?
What a great
It had something about the way you look tonight, Recover Your Soul.
I just didn't like the way we were making records at that particular time. And that's not because I think that album has good songs on it. I just don't like the way they were treated. It was very anemic. It was at a time, I don't know if it was we were trying to be contemporary, and that's no disparagement to Chris Thomas, who produced the album and produced a lot of our albums at that particular point in time. But it was a difficult period for us because I think we were trying too hard to remain relevant at a time when there were other things happening musically coming up, and we were sort of getting pushed into the background a bit. But again, I just remember I had to come over when they were making that record, and I remember it not being a fun experience. I don't mind being in the studio at the best of times, but it just seemed like there was no real organic music on it. It just seemed like somebody was pressing buttons all the time. Everything seemed to be triggered, and I don't like making records like that, especially for me. It was, in a word, boring. I mean, if you listen to that album, it sounds like that. It has no soul to it. And it's a shame because some of the songs were worthwhile.
And yet one of your faves is only 4 years after that, and that's Songs from the West Coast.
Oh, I love Songs from the West Coast. I think that's definitely one of the best albums we've ever made. It was made by a guy called Pat Leonard, who worked with Madonna and went on to work with Leonard Cohen later on, which is kind of interesting. Madonna, Leonard Cohen, you know. So he obviously had a, pretty varied CV. But he was really hands-on. The players on it were great, and I thought the songs were terrific. As I say, if I had to pick, my top 5 Elton albums, that would definitely be in the top 5. I think the songs are really, really good. I like my work on it. And it sounds good too. It's a really great sounding record.
One of the songs, I Want Love.
Oh, again, one of my favorites.
And it gave Robert Downey his comeback.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, Robert Downey. I don't know if anybody's seen the video for that, but it's all done in one tracking shot too. And it was done in the Doheny Mansion, the old Doheny Mansion in LA. And it's Robert Downey mouthing Elton's vocal, basically. And it's literally one shot of him singing the entire song. It's not actually him singing the song. It's just him lip-syncing it. But it's one tracking shot. It's very Martin Scorsese.
And it was when nobody would hire Robert.
Right, yeah.
Because of the drugs problem. And he came back off of that.
Yeah. And there's a great, I don't know if any of you are aware of the Restoration album that I did, where I used a lot of country vocalists doing versions of our songs. But there's a great version by Chris Stapleton on that.
Another great video of a song from that period is This Train Don't Stop Here Anymore.
Well, you know what? I don't remember the video.
That is where
it's a great
He doesn't
version of
remember
that
much, does he?
song On Restoration 2, Lieutenant Cash and Emmylou Harris, who was a goddess to me.
Well, the video, Justin Timberlake played Elton.
Oh, that's right. Okay, yes, I forgot.
And Pee Wee Herman played John Reed.
That's right. Yeah, that is pretty interesting.
Well worth looking up.
There's a version of me in that too. It's supposed to be me. It wasn't Pee Wee Herman.
No. And Eliza Minnelli look alike.
Oh, that's right.
Yes, yeah. Well, a lot of people wondered who Benny was. We have to ask that. Benny and the Jets, which wasn't a big hit in this country. It wasn't an A-side.
No. Well, the interesting story about Benny and the Jets is that Elton fought tooth and nail in the United States to not have it released. He thought there was a guy called Pat Piccolo who worked at Uni Records who said, we've got to put this out. It's exploding on black radio in Philadelphia and getting played on R&B stations. And Elton, that was what turned Elton, because he was a huge R&B fan, soul fan, especially the Philly sound. And that was the catalyst that kind of made him change his mind. But at first he was dead set against it. And it went on to be a huge hit in the States.
No.
I don't even think it was released in the States, was it? Oh,
years later, when DJM no longer had your rights, they put it out.
Oh, okay.
But it was like number 37. But it was number 1 on
But Benny isn't anybody in particular. In fact, again, in the book, right at the beginning of the book, I talk about if anybody's seen Fritz Lang's Metropolis, the robot in there, which is called the Maschinenmensch. That was the sort of idea I had for the sort of robotic idea of Benny and the Jets being the sort of, they all look the same, basically. If you see Robert Palmer, Addicted to Love,
yes,
with the models,
yes.
that was kind of a bit of a rip-off of my idea for the song.
May Robert rest in peace.
Yeah.
One of the things I love about the book is that you talk about the best friends of your life. Very emotionally. But you're not also afraid to say something negative about somebody if it's called for. But when you talk about the people who have been your dear friends, it makes us want to know them.
Oh, that's
There was a fellow from Cashbox who showed you around the music business. There was Mark Palladino. Palladino.
Right.
And I love you taking him back to your old haunts.
Right.
And you suddenly go, oh, this is where I had the first 2 lines of Rocket Man.
Yeah, and we went to the pub in Market Raisin where supposedly I wrote Saturday Night's All Right for Fighting. I might have done, but it's hard to
remember.
Anyway, that was probably it. Yeah. But talking about those kind of people, that was a very important part of the book for me, because those people, whereas people don't know who they are, they're equally as interesting to me as the people that are celebrities. I mean, it's interesting because people of my generation and my peers, who've written books, people always talk about, well, it's full of name dropping. But of course it's full of name dropping, because those are the people that you've existed with throughout your entire career. So how can you write a book and not talk about the Frank Sinatras and the John Lennons and the Bob Marleys? Of course, because they are your contemporaries. You know, so I'm averse to that kind of whole people saying, oh, it's name dropping. You know, there's ways of name dropping. But what I'm basically trying to say is that I find those other characters that you just mentioned, they are equally as important in my life as, say, John Lennon was. And I want people to know about them. And if people aren't interested, well, I'm sorry, you know, that they were important in my life, and the book is about my life.
In which one of the most amazing encounters was with Dali.
Oh, yes.
And what happened to Bernie is just a classic. You can't rewind time, but if you could.
Well, again, you need to compartmentalize it a bit, because again, it's. I spent an evening with Salvador Dali. Okay. Yeah, that's funny enough, and there were two interesting parts about it, because we started out by having drinks in the bar of the St. Regis, but it ended, something very strange happened there. But I think what Paul's alluding to is later on in the evening at dinner, when I was seated next to him, and oh, here I go again. He had this very annoying way of starting to talk to you in English and then ending up his sentences in Spanish. So you never got the punchline there. But you never understood what he was talking about, which was fine, you know, because he was kind of interesting. He was a crazy carny, but he was a brilliant technician and a great draftsman. But as he's talking to me, he was taking things off the table, like cigarette butts, and he had a big napkin, and as he was talking to me, he was doing this design on this napkin, and then he'd take somebody's lipstick and, you know, do that, and a cork, and he'd burn it on a candle and do this. And I was watching him, I was trying to listen to him and watch him do this at the same time, and it was fantastic what he was doing. I mean, he wasn't even looking, and it was a beautiful piece of abstract art, but made with all of this table droppings, basically. And it was awesome, and I was thinking, what's he going to do? You know? And he kept referring to me as a poet, which I was so embarrassed by, because you know, his wife had been married to Paul Eluard, who was probably France's greatest poet, right? So I'm thinking, he said to me at one point, he said, oh, you were like Paul Eluard. And I went, no, I am not a poet. That's the last thing I am. I don't like being referred to as a poet. Anyway, all I cared about was this thing on the table, you know. And at the end of the night, he got up to leave, and he sort of folded it up very neatly, and I thought he was going to put it in his cake. And he threw it into my lap and said, for you, poet. And I'm like, whoa, I'm going to hide this quickly before everybody else at the table sees it. And so I go back to the hotel, and I put it very neatly on the sideboard, you know. And I get up the next morning and go out to get breakfast and take a walk in Central Park. And I came back, and the maid had And I had all these glorious plans of ways that I could preserve it, you know, put it out behind a plastic box, or, you know, yeah.
Easy come, easy.
There you go.
I mentioned to you last night something which has always struck me as funny as well as odd, which is that your best decade in the charts here was the noughties, because songs kept getting covered and coming back.
I don't know what that means. What's it?
The 2000s.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
I wonder what you were talking about last night. Oh, yeah, he was misbehaving.
Well, forgive So, yeah. Okay. But there were things happening in the British charts that you, being in California, would only have known if someone was telling you. Like that Sorry Seems to Be the Hardest Word had gone to #1 in a collaboration with Blue. And that your song had been a hit again in a collaboration with an Italian singer. And
I know none of these.
okay, right, yeah. And then Ghetto Gospel.
Oh yeah, Tupac.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Which samples Madman, you know. And we're, well, if you didn't know much about them, then there's no point in answering that. Because I was going to say, what is it like to have your work be reinterpreted within your own lifetime by other people with great success?
Well, obviously it's a huge compliment, but I think people cover songs all the time by living artists. I don't think that's unusual, is it? No, I mean, anytime you get a cover, it's a great compliment. I'm happy about that.
Here's perhaps the greatest compliment of all. What was Elton's first American #1? Trick question. Okay, it was your song. The B-side of Me and Mrs. Jones.
Oh, right, yeah.
Because, of course, the publishing on a B-side is the same as the publishing on an A-side. So Billy Paul's version of your song was
That's right,
was a
yeah.
#1.
Very happy about that one.
Yeah, that's good.
It was good too.
Yeah.
But I think talking of covers, one of the first cover that Elton and I ever had that really excited us was Aretha Franklin for the song. I mean, that was, when the Queen does one of his songs.
Yes.
Pretty cool.
Yeah.
But I always think about it. I don't think we've had a tremendous amount of covers. People are always a bit hesitant about covering our material. I'm not sure why, whether they think that Elton's is the definitive version, but I don't think we're a really heavily covered act.
Well, as he pointed out to me once, when you were trying to write a hit for somebody else, it would always fail. I mean, like Snookeroo, for example,
Right.
for Ringo.
But at the same time, Paul, I don't think we ever consciously tried to write hit singles.
Right.
We had no concept of that. We just wanted to make great albums, and if something popped out that became a single, then that was the icing on the cake. But we never ever sat down and went, okay, we've got to try and write a hit single. I mean, when we wrote, say, Rocket Man, it was an album track, and it just resonated with people and became a single, the same way as many of the others did.
I have to.
The only time I ever remember us trying to write a one-off single was Philadelphia Freedom.
For Billie Jean King.
Right. I got a good story about that too.
Go for it.
So that was obviously written for Billie Jean King's team, the Philadelphia Freedoms, and Elton was playing a lot of tennis with Billie Jean King at the time, and she asked Elton if he would consider writing a song for the tennis team, and Elton, this has an obscenity in it, but Elton said to Billie Jean King, well, I'd love to do it, but there's no fucking way I'm going to get Taupin to write a song about tennis. So ultimately I wrote something that was a bit more anthemic and had to do with the spirit of the music of Philadelphia. But then it sort of generated to a sort of spirit of America kind of thing, became sort of more of an anthemic. Are they making signals at you?
Well, the interesting thing is they are making signals at me, but in a different color this time. The first time it was red, and now it's blue. But you are making signals at me, aren't you? That's okay. Yes.
Fluids, you understand?
Is this some kind of maritime code?
Anyway, well, that was one of the first times that we ever sort of consciously tried to write something as a single, because it never came out on an
That
album.
was the first single I ever bought.
No, but it was a number one in America. You say in the book, and it was true, that people who are younger than we are can hardly imagine how, for a period of about 3 years, Elton was the biggest show business star in the world. He wasn't just a star.
Right. I think a lot of Elton's history has been rewritten by people. I think now, when people sort of look back, or the younger generation look back at that era, they think of people, a perfect example is David Bowie, and that's not to disparage again, anybody else. But I don't think people do realize how enormous he was. I mean, he was gigantic, and nobody even came close, And then again, the people that were huge at the same time, the people I completely forgot. John Denver was massive in the States. So was Kenny Rogers. But people don't want to talk about them because they're unhip. But sometimes you have, and I think a lot of it has to do with people don't know how to deal with Elton's personality and the costumes, and they think that demean the artistic integrity of things. And I think that's, as I say, and I think for that reason people have tended to rewrite history and underplay his true magnetic personality that was huge at the time.
As they calculated, 2% of the world's album sales were Elton at that time. As we draw to a close, noting that we have not even had time to talk about Little Yellow Jacket or other aspects of your rodeo and cowboy life, for which read the book, it is fascinating. It's another very real part of Bernie's life that is so important. But the important thing is that both you and Elton, since 1990, found the loves of your life and have 2 children each.
Absolutely, yeah. That's it. I mean, it is interesting that the parallels of our life have come together, even if it's even possible to come together even more. Yeah, we've both been in relationships for over 20 years, both married, he has 2 sons, I have 2 daughters, and everything in our professional life now is in-house. I'm managed by my wife, he's managed by his husband, and there are no peripheral 10%ers anywhere. Everything we do is in the family. Can you turn the lights off a little bit? I've seen on my Instagram that a lot of people came from other places. Are there people here that came from Poland? Where?
Right here.
Thank you. And who came from France?
We.
Yeah.